Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of That 60s Recording podcast. My name is Joe Montague, and I am your host, I suppose. And what better place to start than with an absolute legend of 60s music and just recording in general than with Mr. George Martin, Sir George Martin, legendary producer and arranger who not only worked with the Beatles, obviously, but went on to work with the likes of Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jeff Beck, Cleo Lane, Neil Sedaka, America, Cheap Trick, UFO, Ultravox, and a whole host of other artists. And today we'll be discussing George's life and work with an absolute knowledge of this subject, Mr. Jason Kruppa, who hosts a podcast called Recording the Beatles, which if you haven't heard it, I urge you to check it out. Jason knows everything there is to know about George Martin, and we will discuss George's work with the Beatles, what made him a great producer, and how his work on comedy before working with the Beatles had such a massive influence on what he did with them. So I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Jason Kruppa. So today we're joined by Jason Kruppa, who is the creator and writer of a podcast called Producing the Beatles, which, if you haven't heard this already, I don't know why you haven't, because it's genuinely unbelievable. And I know you can hear me saying this, and I don't care. I'm going to completely flatter you because it's ridiculous. It's every single one is a complete goldmine of information. You could listen to the whole thing umpteen times and still keep learning. So go and check this out. I'm going to say more about this in the intro as well. You'll have heard me just spouting about it. I wonder if you could just talk through a little bit about the process of the podcast, because it is genuinely, it's such a well put together, thoughtful, educational piece of content. If that's not too bad of a term to call it, could you just talk a bit about how you put it together?
No, thank you. I mean, I appreciate it. When I started out on this, it was actually at the urging of my friend Tim Riley, who knew that I had all this research and had gone down all these kind of crazy rabbit holes and contributed to other books, including one of his books. And he said, you should really do a podcast. This would really suit your expertise. And at the time, I had never listened to any podcasts, so I had to go listen to a few and figure out what it was about and see if it was something I wanted to do. And the one that really just I thought was a good model for the kind of thing that I would want to do, the quality and the depth, wasn't even a music podcast. It's called You Must Remember This, and it's by Karina Longworth, and it's about old Hollywood, basically, 30s and 40s mostly, but she covers a wide range. First, she calls it the first century of Hollywood, and that just gave me a form to think, well, this is how I can do this. And the first couple were really easy, and they got progressively harder as I became more ambitious and thought, oh, I can do all these things. Let me try some stuff. So that's sort of how it began, and the process is it's very intuitive. I wish I had a plan, and I said these are the things that I'm setting out to do. I do kind of have a broad idea. This is about the Beatles and this is about George Martin, but the subtext that I've always kept in mind is that this is about how people collaborate. This is about when that collaboration is perfectly balanced, and these five people in particular, were so beautifully tuned into each other that they really sort of picked up slack for each other. So it always seemed like they had this kind of perfect synchronization, perfect balance. So, that's one part of it. One is also to teach people about music production and how music works sort of fundamentally. I'm talking about a lot of musical ideas too, as well as production ideas. And because I know a lot of this stuff is not common knowledge, and in a lot of cases, I when I interview people, I kind of know half the answer, or I can get to a point, and then I kind of hit a wall. So I kind of depend on the people I interview to fill in some of this information, which I know is there, but I don't have the technical or musical knowledge to be able to express it. In a lot of ways, in that sense, it's for me, it's kind of educational, and I get to learn something too while I'm doing this.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I'm a trained musician, and even the musical ideas that you go over that I already knew about, having them explained in the way that you explain them is quite refreshing. I find it enjoyable to listen to things that, even though I know how it's already working, I still enjoy hearing the way that you put it together, and especially when you get musicians in to replay some of the musical ideas, it's definitely brings it to life.
Well, thank you. That's, like I said, I didn't really have a plan, and when I set out to do this, I thought, I finished the first 2 episodes, and I thought, oh, no one's going to listen to this. No one's going to care. This is too deep and too, just too nerdy, So I'm really glad to hear, when people write and say that they're enjoying the podcast, they're getting a lot out of it, because, it's satisfying to me. I think these ideas are interesting, and that's why I want to talk about them. But I do always have that sort of little doubt in the back of my mind that it's like, have I gone, too far down the rabbit hole? Am I going to lose people? So I do try to keep it accessible and not really go into deep detail. But there is a lot of detail to this, and it's a balance, best I can do. But I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Definitely. On the website, it says you've been presumably studying in a sort of official capacity, George Martin, for a decade or so. But I guess that the interest goes a lot longer than that.
Yeah, I had originally just out of interest in the Beatles, I got obsessed with the Revolver album about 15 years ago. And the question became, for me, how did George Martin know how to do the things that he did on that album to make it sound like that, to sort of create that production? Because as I looked into it, I thought, he really had a lot to do with this. And, no one's written anything about him that talks about sort of where his ideas came from and, how he mastered this production process. And that sort of launched me into kind of looking into his background and digging through a lot of records and, just kind of doing my own legwork, my own research. And I ended up at EMI Archives 4 times, making a lot of photocopies and a lot of notes, and they must have thought I'd lost my mind.
So is that at Abbey Road?
Yeah. Well, yeah, EMI Archives is out in Hayes, so it's west of London. But I did go to Abbey Road once. My last trip over, they offered me a tour. So one of the people that worked at the archive showed me around one day. So that was a great experience. And at the time, he never said this explicitly, but the sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge was that George Martin and Giles Martin were there working on the mix for Love. And I think they were sort of hoping, they'd take a break and I'd run into them, but it never happened. But it was, it was a great experience being I got to go into Studio 2 and hang out there for a minute. So that was exciting.
It's a special place. I've been once, and it's just such a instantly recognizable sound, that room.
Yeah.
I was fortunate to play some drums in it.
Oh, that's great.
And as soon as you start playing, you can just hear. I think the sound of that room is inbuilt into our subconscious. Just, listening to Beatles records, and you just you feel at home there straight away.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, I've been to Graceland, and I've been to various other places and seen these different studios and sort of these kind of like in popular 20th century music, just this sense of like this is a kind of a sacred place. But being at Abbey Road and in Studio 2 was just something else. You
said that the Revolver album was your first one. I know. So the first one you really got into. And that's the same story for so many people. I wonder what it is about that album particularly that gets people.
It's, Sgt. Pepper kind of blew everybody's minds. It was the big watershed, I actually had that before I had Revolver, and I'd heard all these things about it, and day in the life is just how do you recover from that? Just after that, you're sort of like, well, what else is there, right? And then I just listened to more albums and read more, and I just think it's a fascinating record. It's so compact, it's so concise, and every song is a new idea. And there's what is that? I think it was the Gramophone. This is the review that I always think of when I think of Revolver, and the reviewer called it said that it sounded like it was smoking hot newness. And every song on there still has sort of crackles with that energy of like we're discovering something. We can here's something we can do we didn't realize we could do. That's my take on it, because I listen to the songs and they still sound exciting.
I think that's such a great way of putting it. I've not heard that review before. I think that sums it up really nicely. Revolver and Rubber Soul seem to be the two albums that hook people in, and then you go more avant-garde with some of the later stuff, or I personally quite like a lot of the sort of bubblegum pop of the early sounds.
Yeah, it all has its pleasures, right?
Maybe we'll talk a bit about George Martin specifically, about how he came to start working with them. I know he was contacted by somebody about the Beatles, but he hadn't seemed to do many pop sessions specifically before then.
Well, the story that Mark Lewison stumbled across was that he was essentially ordered to sign them because they wanted to get the publishing on one of the early songs, one of the Lennon-McCartney songs. And so he had passed on them just like everybody else at EMI. And they saw an opportunity to get some publishing money, and they said, you should do this. And the suggestion has been that they knew about his affair with his secretary, who became his wife a few years later, and kind of hinted that you should do this, and it would be a shame if this scandal came out, or just kind of a we know what you're doing, and we don't approve of it, and be a good boy, George, and sign this group and take care of this. That's my interpretation. That's Mark has written that, and in not so many words maybe, but yeah, I mean, George Martin told this story for many years that he gave him a chance, and he just had this instinct, and I think that's part of his own sort of myth making. And you begin telling stories, and then they become true to you. They become sort of your preferred narrative. So that's the nuts and bolts of how he came to work with them. But I think that there is a lot of truth about the chemistry he felt with them, because that persisted. That was something that was real and was clear. So I think he liked their personalities, and I think he did once he got him in the studio, and once he heard them at that first session, even though he wasn't in charge of that session at the beginning, I think he responded to that. And he was running a little label that didn't kind of flew under the radar, and he did these comedy records, which we can talk about more, because I think that's a huge part of the story. But he was kind of his own little fiefdom within EMI, and got to do what he wanted. And if he felt like he could have fun with this band, then he would do it. He'd certainly done that plenty of times before with other artists. So it figures that he would just say, oh, these guys are fun, maybe we'll get some records out of them, but I like their company.
What about the comedy records do you think was there? I mean, I can almost piece together what you're alluding to in my head, but
right. This is something I'm going to get into in a later episode of the podcast, maybe a couple of episodes, because it's such a big subject. He started out running when he was put in charge of Parlophone. He sort of had to figure out how to make it work and make money. So he was producing everything. He was producing classical music. He was producing Scottish dance records. He was producing pop records and crooners, and anything he did skiffle records, anything that he could do to try to get a hit. And then he stumbled across, these different artists who he began to have success with, and one of them was Peter Sellers, and Flanders and Swan with the At the Drop of a Hat album proved to be very successful. And then he seemed to have realized that this was a niche and he could do something that nobody else was doing, so he began recording more of this material, and it got popular. It was never really hugely popular, but it was enough for him to kind of stake a claim for himself in the pop marketplace and distinguish himself. And all told, he recorded, it's something like 14 or 15 comedy albums from, I think, about 1957 to 1962 or 64 maybe. And some of those are just transcriptions of live stage shows, but some of those are really heavily produced records. And there are 3 or 4 of them that really stand out, where you see that here's a guy who's really interested in using the studio in unusual ways, and it's not like pop records at all. It's really more like radio productions, what he's doing. But the reason this is important for the Beatles is that he's experimenting all the time with these records. And he says later that with the comedy records, they were really challenging because he had to come up with a new idea or a new sound or new effects or new something for every record. And he thought having a pop artist like Cliff Richard would be easy. He'd just find him material and they'd record it and he'd have #1 hits and it'd be great. But once he found the Beatles and he realized that they were responding to his production ideas, they ultimately became just like the comedy records in the sense that they needed a new idea for every record. They needed a new idea for every song. So it really sort of set the stage for that kind of dynamic with them.
It's so interesting. I honestly hadn't even given it a second's thought before.
It's really a kind of a hole in the research about them, because it's, he had this 12 years experience running this little label, and he ran it himself from 1954, 55. So he was doing everything. And yeah, I think like I said, I want to talk more about this in detail in the podcast and play examples. But yeah, once I started listening to these records, I thought, oh, this is where it all comes from. This is the sort of the crucible where he's learning his skills. And one person who's very important to this was Stuart Eltham, who was recording engineer and who had trained Norman Smith and was still active around the time of the Beatles and worked on some of their sessions. But he and George Martin worked very closely on some of these comedy records. So I think his expertise in the studio and understanding just the technical aspect of what could be done and what needed to be done in order to pull off the things George wanted had a big impact on George Martin's understanding of how the studio worked.
It's fascinating how many of these things, sort of events or series of events, sort of came together in what in creating the Beatles' career, and it's just another one, like you say, that's overlooked. That is clearly overlooked, but is another serendipitous sort of facet that was like, oh well, of course George was prepared to do these things because of this, and it's amazing how many of those things came together to create the career of the Beatles.
Right, and I mean, some of it is that they were sponges. They responded to the world around them. I think the difference with George Martin and what he was doing was that he was a really receptive audience to them in a way that nobody had really been receptive before. So they were bringing him songs and they were recording, and he was giving them sort of feedback and encouragement and saying, try this, or speed up, please me, giving a different arrangement. So he wasn't shutting them down. He was acting like a good teacher and encouraging them. And, they responded to that, and Paul and John in particular just ran with it. Paul, I think Paul really kind of wanted to be George Martin in some ways, because he took a lot of those production ideas and expanded upon them. And Chris Thomas told me recently that he really learned more about production from watching what Paul McCartney was doing during the White Album sessions, just sort of his process for creating a recording.
One thing that sprung to mind while you were talking about the comedy side of things is how what's the right word? Prescriptive EMI or Abbey Road was at the time. Everything was white coats and brown coats and doing things in a very particular way. And I suppose comedy doesn't always fit into that mold. It's supposed to escape that kind of stuff. So he will have been doing silly things to get silly noises and using the studio in a way that wasn't what they were doing for the classical sessions. Maybe I'm speculating, but maybe being given freedom that he might not have had if he was solely doing classical sessions.
Well, he, like I said, he ran Parlophone himself, so he had a certain amount of freedom to record whatever he wanted and do it however he wanted to do it.
Yeah.
One thing is that the 4-track machines were typically used for, to be able to control the mix. So it was, you record, whatever your layout would be, maybe for a classical session or a pop session. But the emphasis was more, I think, on my impression is it was really more for classical to be able to balance the recordings. But what he did is he took 4-track, and he would request it. You see it in the forms that I saw at EMI, where he said, a 4-track recorder, please. He knew he was going to need this to accomplish what he did. So he was taking the technology and using it in ways that they weren't really anticipating. They had bought these to be able to balance instruments better in the mix, not to do some sort of wild, crazy production like he was doing.
One thing I was wanting to ask you about is his training, his classical training and interest in classical music. I'm assuming that he had input into the vocal harmonies that they were putting together, which was all influenced by classical music. And then as the arrangements got more ambitious, his classical training is sort of coming to the forefront, and it brought perhaps a bit of a maturity, or encouraged a bit of a maturity in what Paul and John were writing.
Well, as far as the vocal harmonies, that was really them. The only time he may have done this a few different times later on, but the only time he ever specifically spoke about working with them on vocal harmonies, was working with them on Because. And he said that he went to the piano and told them the notes to sing for those harmonies. So, but the main thing is that they had this, John and Paul had this sort of intuitive sense of how to sing with each other. And if you listen to you may have the bootleg where you can hear all the takes of I Saw Her Standing There, and they're changing little subtle things every performance, every take. And that's them. That's not him telling them what to do. And George had that too. I mean, George really gets a lot of short shrift, and I think he's an important part musically. Like, he had a great sense of melody, and he had a great sense of chord structure. And the example, one of the big examples early on is "She Loves You," and that's his idea to do that 6th chord on the vocals at the end, which George Martin thought was kind of corny and old fashioned. So that's them. They really had a great sense of vocal harmony. And again, that's another point that's overlooked. I would love for somebody to do a podcast or a paper or some documentary about Beatles vocal harmonies, because I think it's just, they were great harmony singers.
Yeah, unbelievable harmony singers. I play in a show. We do, lots of Beatles shows do This Boy, and that's just the highlight of the show for me, even though as a drummer I don't play a huge amount in it, but it's such a special song, and their harmonies were one of the main factors of why they're such an attractive band to listen to.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the things that's missing from so many Beatle covers over the years is people will sing those songs solo for solo voice, and they don't take into account the harmonies, which to me is a huge part of their appeal, just their musical appeal.
There's a quote I took from one of the episodes of the podcast. It might have been the second one, where you mentioned that he was number one for 38 of the 52 weeks of that year. I'm not sure how many of those weeks were with Beatles songs or or with other acts.
I'd have to check what the statistics are for how many were Beatles songs, but I mean, quite a few.
Yeah, just seems completely. I mean, you just have to look at the list of artists he's produced and songs and albums he's produced, and there's definitely something with George. I mean, the Beatles obviously were incredibly special in their own right, but I wonder if you have any idea of what it is about him as an individual that means he can pull the best out of the musicians around him.
Yeah, I mean, he had a special relationship with them, which is, like nothing else in the history of popular music. I think it's really unique. So that, that chemistry that the five of them had it's clearly something was there. He was a talented person. If you listen to his recordings before the Beatles, he's clearly somebody who's thinking about things and has an unusual perspective on things. Not a lot of those recordings were hits, and some are interesting, but they're not necessarily good from an objective point of view. And the Mersey stuff in '63, which is why he had all those number one hits that year, was because of the Beatles, because of Brian Epstein, because he had these opportunities, and he was ahead of the curve on this. He just had this handed to him, and happened to produce these people, and he did a very good job with the artists that he had. And he had the foresight to be able to look at these different people like Jerry and the Pacemakers, and even though he didn't think that Billy J. Kramer had a great voice, he still got something out of him. He had the sense that he could make this work. So he was a problem solver, and I think he was. If you look at the other producers who were active at the time, they were mostly a lot older and kind of came from that orchestral background, that kind of, band experience. And they had a very specific way of sort of looking at the music business, the record business. And George Martin didn't really have that. He had this kind of, he was always the kind of junior member of EMI. So he was playing catch up, the whole time he was there. And I think that imprinted something on him. The sense that, he had to work harder, he had to try different things, he had to be more innovative, he had to kind of make a space for himself where, these established people like Norman Newell and Norrie Paramore just sort of, breezed in and breezed out and did their thing. And, they respected him as a colleague, but, I also think they probably kind of looked askance at him and said, like, what are you doing? So I think that's a part of his personality. He had to compete with that, and he had to find unusual ways of doing it. So, and I think just something about him as a person, he had a great sense of precision and skill and kind of a workshop mentality. He'd wanted to design aircraft early on, and I think there's some element of, there's a designer, there's somebody who wants to build things. And his father was a carpenter, so I think he saw a lot of that very explicitly. Here's somebody building things physically. So, can't say for certain that that's what it is, but that sort of all makes sense to me. That's kind of a line I can trace.
Yeah, that definitely does seem to make sense. It makes sense in my mind as well, hearing you saying it. He has to make space for himself, as you put it, and then later, the way you put it in the podcast episode was made himself available for the recording of Let It Be, and sort of we're talking about the very late point of the Beatles' career. He didn't feel the need to make space for himself there. It's almost like the inmates running the asylum kind of thing. If he was musically a father figure, his musical children, if you, it's such a crude analogy, but they'd grown up and taken over, and he could stand back and let them do their thing and not feel the need to press anything on them.
Right. I mean, he with the Beatles in particular, he knew when to step back, and he knew he was dealing with incredible talents and incredible egos, but he recognized that they had surpassed him in a lot of ways. They had taken what he taught them and kind of run with it and made it into things that he wouldn't have imagined on his own. And that's the great thing about collaboration is that you present ideas to each other and something else new will come out of it because everybody has a different perspective. Yeah, so I think he did realize that, especially during the Get Back sessions, that things were out of control, and there was really no way for him to step up and say, "Look, chaps, we have to get it together, boys." That just wasn't going to happen. He could have done that in 1963 because he was in charge, but by 1969, they'd conquered the world, and they had their own ideas, and at this point, it's sort of like, well, we'll follow along and see what happens. And there's so many reasons why that that project was the way it was. That's probably too big of a topic to get into, but yeah, fortunately they did get it back together for Abbey Road.
I've just finished reading the Jeff Emerick book, which I know there's a lot of opinions about this book, but I try to take things on face value. George doesn't seem to get much of a mention in Jeff's book, and Jeff seems to take a lot of credit, this is in my opinion, for a lot of the innovation in the studio through the albums that he worked on with them on. And I wonder whether George had more influence than that book would have us believe. It makes sense to me that George would just progress to doing some of the things that they did with, the Peppers album or Revolver and that kind of stuff. And
it's a complicated topic. I have tremendous respect for what Jeff Emerick did, and I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him at the White Album Conference in 2018 because he had died just before he was supposed to be a guest. But I think some of that book is a corrective. Maybe overcorrecting, saying, look, the engineers did a lot on these records. This was important. And if some people may know about the Recording the Beatles book, which I think they talked to every engineer who was still alive and just did incredible work to try to get this stuff down and give those guys credit because, the technical team really had a lot to do with the sound of those records. Just sort of like sounds going through microphones and being processed. And Jeff Emerick again was young when he began engineering for them, and he had ideas, and George Martin saw that he had ideas and was not afraid to try different things, try new things. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship with George Martin, with Jeff Emerick, with the Beatles, and Jeff Emerick and Norman Smith both, and I think Jeff Emerick picked up a lot of things from Norman Smith because Norman Smith was older and he'd been there longer and he had more experience, and he sort of established this baseline for how they would work. All those people were working together, and we see George Martin, we see the Beatles, and that's sort of the face of it, but there was a lot going on behind the scenes that is maybe too complex and too technical for kind of the average reader or average listener to grasp. But I think it's just as important. So while there may be instances in his book where he overstates things or he has errors and whatever the sort of details that we can get lost in, I think the bigger picture is that he helped them change all sounds. That was the idea on Revolver. And from then it sort of developed, and he worked with them, and then he didn't work with them, and he worked with them again. But I think he probably, I can't speak for him, obviously. My impression is that he he thought he deserved some credit for what he had done. And to, maybe clarify and, maybe a more even-handed biographer would step in and say, here's what Jeff Emmerich did, here's what George Martin did. Let's give people credit for what they actually did and make it clear. But often, that's difficult to do. I don't know if that really answers your question. It's kind of it's like I said, it's very complicated.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and I think that's a really balanced point of view on it, which is why I wanted to ask you the question, really, because I think it's really, like you say, it's easy to get lost in some of the information in that book, but if you think of it as a redressing the balance a little bit, that's a really nice way of putting it, because I don't think everybody who, from what I can tell, everybody who was involved in the Beatles sort of sphere, bar maybe one or two, was a fairly level-headed, on-point person. They'd come to work with them just by happenstance because they were working at EMI. They hadn't, they just were promoted to the role, and they got the job at EMI for a reason, and they all just seemed like really, really great people. So I can't imagine for a second that anyone would be trying to sort of get more credit for something than they deserve.
Right, and like I said, I think the engineers have not been given the credit they deserve over the years. Because engineers is kind of a backroom thing. Being a producer was a backroom thing until George Martin and even Phil Spector, people like that, sort of brought it to the forefront in the '60s, and the spotlight began being directed at them. And, even with that, even with, more than 50 years of that kind of a conversation, I think it's still kind of an elusive subject. Like, what do producers do? So, it kind of gets lost where, people say, oh, well, the producer runs everything. He runs the board and he does this and he does that. And it's different from person to person. And with engineers, it's often different too. Some engineers step in and can do more production work, just because of their background, because of their skill set. So I'm not sure where I was going there, but that's sort of, I guess.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting about Abbey Road is how, I personally, as an individual, like structured things, and I really enjoy how Abbey Road was structured as a sort of an entity, and you had the second engineer running the tape, and then you had the engineer doing this and the producer doing that, and then you graduated through the roles. So I think, and it was interesting to see how, as you say, I think in the '60s, as the '60s progressed, those roles became a little bit blurred, to the point where we're at now, where often an artist is the producer, the engineer, and the artist all mixed up together, and no two situations are the same ever.
Right, and I mean, I like I said, I think that by the '60s, that began to the structure began to change in how production worked. So, and that that was because of George Martin, and because he and the Beatles sort of upset what the standard procedure was.
One of the main reasons why I'm personally really into why the '60s fascinates me so much is for that reason. I'm really conscious of taking up too much more of your time. I've got a couple of easy questions.
No, go for it. Go for it. I'm good. Yeah.
Is Revolver still your favorite album?
I mean, I don't know that Revolver has ever been my favorite album. I just got obsessed with it because I realized that was kind of ground zero for everything. I mean, I love so many things on the White Album. I like the idea of the White Album. It's just to think that these very different people had all these different interests, and they're bringing them to bear within this one group, and it just seems like a glorious mess. I've said before that I think the White Album is Revolver through the looking glass. It's just everything that was on that record and blown up and expanded and turned up to 11, and all of the ideas just kind of thrown at the wall, and really everything they learned since Revolver, both as people and as musicians, artists. I think all those things are still there, but it's a much richer, much more complex tapestry that they've created. But then there's some days where I just want to listen to side 2 of Abbey Road, and it's immensely satisfying. It's just such a the medley, the end of the medley with Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight in the end is just it's transcendent. So it changes, and sometimes I just want to hear This Boy.
I'm with you. I don't think I have a favorite. I think it just they all depends what mood you're in. So what would you? I mean, I'll admit, I'm sure it's fairly obvious through this conversation. I haven't read anything about George Martin yet. What would you recommend as a first reading port of call?
Well, Kenneth Womack, who's a friend of mine and we're co-authoring a book together right now, wrote a two volume biography of George Martin, which is outstanding. Hits all the marks where it needs to, and he has some really great background research. Really, just as I read it, I just kept nodding, going like, he got it right. So it's some books I read and I just think, oh, that's right, and that's not right. With him, he really did the legwork, and he talked to a lot of the right people he needed to talk to, and got the story right. So I highly recommend those books. And George wrote his autobiography, All You Need Is Ears, which I think if you want to get an idea of his own personality and his charm, because he was a very charming person, and he had a goofy sense of humor. He loved puns. I think you could read that. Don't look for details. Don't look for technical knowledge, because he really doesn't go into it there. And he was not a technical studio producer. He was more of a creative studio producer. So his classical background, obviously he has the technique, but his ideas about production in that book are probably what I would recommend looking for. But as far as an overall biography of him, can't beat Ken Womack's books.
So that's the Life of the Beatles, producer George Martin.
Yes,
that's the title of the book. I think I've pulled it up on the website here.
Yeah.
What's the? Are you allowed to say what your new book is?
Yes.
Or is it a secret until it's finished?
No. If it is a secret, it's the worst kept secret, because I keep talking to everybody about it. It is the making of All Things Must Pass, and how that gave birth to Layla, the Layla album. So we're sort of covering George and Eric Clapton in 1970, and all the sort of interconnections between the two of them. And yeah, it's such a fascinating story, and there's so much about these sessions that hasn't been covered that I'm every week I'm just sort of stumbling across one thing or another, and interviewing people and learning something new and getting great little stories that nobody's ever told before. So yeah, that's what we're working on, and it's like I said, it's really exciting. He actually had to talk me into it, because I was a little skeptical, and then I just started looking at the possibilities, and I thought, oh, okay, this could be good. This could be a really interesting book. So
yeah, I mean, I'm curious to read it already. I mean, All Things Must Pass. I was late to the party with that. I mean, I just focused my listening on just Beatles things, and then through conversations with friends of mine, started to delve into other things. And I was lent a copy of All Things Must Pass by a friend of mine, and it's one of those albums for me where, sure, we've all had these experiences where you listen to it and it feels comfortable to listen to even on the first go round. And I don't know anything about George's relationship with Clapton, really. So that sounds like a really interesting book.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, the making of All Things Must Pass itself is this epic thing. And I mean, I agree with you. When I first heard it, I was late to the party. I was born in 1969, and my parents weren't necessarily big fans of rock music at the time, in the 70s. So I came across it in the 80s, when as a teenager, and I started just sort of gobbling up all music I could get my hands on. And a friend of mine made me a tape of that. And I remember hearing the title song and hearing that pedal steel, that kind of ghostly pedal steel at the beginning. And it just rang the most familiar bell. And I played it for my mother and I said, "Do you know this song? Did you listen to this song when I was little? Because I swear I know this. This just sounds like this is in my DNA or something." It was the strangest thing.
It's one of the special things about music. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
It's been so great to speak to you. You're such a wealth of information on this, on all of this topic, and I really look forward to more of your podcast episodes, and I really look forward to this book that's coming.
Thank you.
When you finished it and it's out, I'll have to read it and have you back on and chat again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about it. I mean, I like I said, I love the album, and any excuse to talk about it, I will. And then I can tell you a lot more about what I learned in the writing, what Ken and I both learned, because we're obviously both sort of stumbling across things and going, "Oh, I didn't know that." So, yeah, be happy to.
Well, yeah, thanks again for speaking to me. I do really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
After we finished recording, Jason and I were chatting about the next episode of his podcast, Producing the Beatles, and it turns out to be a rather special episode, so have a listen to him talking about it here.
It's the season 1 finale, and it's covering the cellos and trumpet score for Strawberry Fields Forever. So I went into a recording studio a while back with 7 musicians, and we re-recorded the score completely, the whole thing. And we used the Beatles percussion track as the backing. So they followed that to keep the tempo and to keep the feel as close as possible to the record. And I'm happy to say I think it's pretty close. A friend of mine in a different studio who's a big Beatles fan did a mix for me. And it's incredible. It was incredible to be in the room while people were playing this music, and I can't conduct, but I was having to conduct the trumpet players because the tempo is difficult to follow. That drum track doesn't really. George Martin had said himself, it doesn't stick to a quartz synchronization, so it varies a little bit. But they.
Oh, I know that from my experience trying to learn that song. It messes with you a little bit.
Yeah, and it's I talk about how that drum track was created and sort of what all went into it, and I was able to pull an isolation out of a bootleg mix so that we could use that to follow, because it had none of this has been officially released. And the reason I wanted to re-record the score is because it wasn't available, and for people to be able to listen to. And I had the engineer close mic everything, so I could pull out the trumpets and just listen to the cellos, or I could listen to one cello, or I could listen to one trumpet if I wanted to, just to be able to explain things in the episodes, so that I could point to something specific and then play it. And I thought that recording was too interesting just to leave for the podcast, so for a small fee, you'll be able to download it from Apple Music, and if you want lossless, because I like lossless, you can download it from Bandcamp as well. And so you'll be able to hear the complete score in excellent sound, and you'll be able to hear all sorts of details you couldn't hear before. So that should be up in the next week or so.
And I can confirm that is out now. It's on Bandcamp. Just go and search Producing the Beatles. I've bought it. It's incredible. Go and check out Jason's podcast. It's unbelievable. And I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Please like, share, rate and review this podcast if you enjoyed it. Next time we're going to be chatting to none other than Mr. Ken Scott, which is an incredible conversation to have had. I am privileged to have spoken to him. I'll be out in 2 weeks' time. I'd like to thank my good friend Joe Kane for the theme music, and another good friend of mine, David Henshaw, for creating all the artwork for this podcast. You can find me at www.allyouneedisdrums.com. I'm also on Instagram at allyouneedisdrums. and Facebook / All You Need Is Drums. All the information and show notes for this podcast will be at allyouneedisdrums.com / that 60s recording podcast. So there, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.